I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the Center for Latin American Studies. I'm Harley Shaken, the chair of the center, and we're very pleased to begin our spring 2014 Bay Area Latin America Forum. And I think there's no more important issue than what we will be discussing today for Latin America and the Caribbean. The theme is planning for sustainable energy systems. It is a technically very challenging and important area, and it is politically vital for Latin America going forward. So there's a lot of really exciting, important, and critical issues to deal with in this area. I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Dan Kammen, who will introduce the panel as we go through the program. They will give a presentation, and then we should have time for questions and comments and a discussion. To really do justice to Dan Kammen would take longer than the event itself. So let me just say he's the class of 1935, distinguished professor of energy at UC Berkeley with parallel appointments in the Energy Resources Group, the Goldman School, and the Department of Nuclear Engineering. So please join me in welcoming Dan Kammen.
Harley, thanks so much, and thanks for the class team for both putting together and being so classy in how they put things together compared to some of the things that we do. So my main job actually is to be a traffic policeman, to manage what I hope is kind of a bit of an unusual seminar in the sense we're going to have 3 doctoral students in the Energy Resources Group do the bulk of the work. And this isn't just so I can relax and sit up there and write mean notes, but it's to try to give you kind of a flavor of the scope of projects that our group, the Renewable Appropriate Energy Laboratory, are doing in partnership with a number of groups. We have one of them in the room, Blue Energy, represented by Matthias Craig. And what I'll highlight is a number of different aspects of what we are engaged in on campus and beyond in terms of understanding what do we know about an energy transition that needs to happen. And Latin America is in a very interesting position. They're ahead of the curve in many ways in terms of the most basic numbers, and that is greenhouse gas emissions for energy, but in some ways behind the curve in terms of building some of the new companies and institutions we're going to need. And this talk is really designed to highlight those pieces. And so I'll do a few words in the beginning. And then Juan Pablo Carvallo will speak next, in particular about what we're learning about the Chilean grid, and with all of the deep class connections in Chile, that's particularly interesting. And then Rebekah Shirley, who is from the Caribbean, both Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica, will talk about a different set of tools we're using to understand job creation and approaches to sustainability. And then Diego Ponce de Leon will talk about efforts in Nicaragua and in Mexico in terms of really tools that look a little more similar to what Juan Pablo will talk about, and understanding more of a regional connection. And so I'll highlight those as we go because I need to be brief in the comments. We're not going to do a lot of technical detail today. We are going to assume, and apologies for those of you who are experts on electrical engineering and some of the quantitative aspects of energy systems modeling, this is a talk about those things. It is not a talk within those things. So we will summarize results and happy to answer questions, but this is really about the process. We collectively in the Rail Laboratory have a couple interesting connections and levers that I'm hoping that you'll ask about at the end and you'll take advantage of. And one of which is that both Diego and Rebekah have just finished serving in the first year as what we called Sherpas, which didn't translate as well as I was hoping it would have. But the Sherpas are part of a Fulbright Nexus program, and this is a U.S. State Department sponsored program that identified a series of fellows, and we have one of the fellows from last year's cohort in the room. We have other fellows from the previous year cohort, like Paz Gutierrez, who some of you may know, who was in the first cohort. Matthias was in the second cohort. And the coming round of these fellowships is going to be 2-year fellowships, 5 of which are available for US citizens and permanent residents, 5 of which are available for Brazilian permanent residents and citizens, and 10 of which are available to people throughout the rest of the Americas. And it's to focus on exclusively team-based projects around these 5 topics, and the application process for that is still open. There was just a webinar last week you can find on the State Department on the Fulbright website, but it's an example of building partnerships around a set of themes. We will focus more on the first one and perhaps the third one here, but in both of the team efforts from last year, one of which was focused on a detailed study of Nicaragua that both Matthias and Blue Energy and Rebekah were involved with. It's an opportunity to engage going forward in these areas. And they're quite generous fellowships for team projects in these areas. The starting ground for a discussion of where we want to go in all of these efforts is something that California is a useful and interesting partner on, because California, at least to some extent, has gone through the transition, or is doing well on the transition that we're talking about. And that is dramatically changing the energy system, not just the pre-existing system. If you happen to be endowed with a lot of hydro, such as Brazil, you look at it differently than if you have a lot of fossil fuel in the mix and you're trying to wean yourself off of it. But California has a long history in this area, and so I go back to a slide made in the early 70s, and without doing the details of the different bits, this is back when PowerPoint slides were drawn with a drafts person, and I mean, I know it's a different world. They look a little prettier in some ways, but the goal is basically there was a business as usual path that California thought it was on. And it involved building lots of new fossil fuel power plants, some hydro and gas, and a lot of nuclear, so much so that at one point California thought it was going to build 1 nuclear plant every 5 miles of coastline. And today we have 1 remaining nuclear plant in operation. And what has been the impact of population growth, of affluence, of the role of efficiency. And this graph really launched 1,000 careers and billions of dollars of savings. And it's really all about what can you do institutionally to shave off from this business as usual path down to what has actually happened. And so everything in the triangle effectively is savings. And just to show it's not just a picture of where we might go, this is a version of that picture for what happened in the United States, where there was a growth in energy use per person, and it slowed somewhat after the OPEC crisis, but it continued. California took a very different path. Denmark and other places are even better than we are. But again, this triangle of savings is what we're looking at. Today, we're going to highlight a bunch of different perspectives on what are the tools you need to basically realize not only this triangle of savings, but what the international science community says we need, and that is basically from this baseline, so not where we are as a country, but from where we could be of not growing energy use. We need to cut by about 80% in the next 37.6 years. That's an unprecedented change in the system, and so what you'll hear today from each of the students is what they're working on with colleagues in the Caribbean, in Chile, in Nicaragua, and in Mexico on a number of these efforts. So one of the tools we're going to utilize is a model called Switch, which will be described in a little bit more detail later on, but it is basically a model to examine how does the grid work in a given municipality, from a city to a country to a region today, and how might it work in the future. And we have some interesting engagements on the California side with the California Energy Commission, with the Inter-American Bank for Development, where Juan Pablo was based for the summer and doing part of the work on Chile. And so we will look at this as one of the many tools to think about how much energy might we deploy where, what does that mean in terms of cost, reliability, amount of greenhouse gas emissions, and again, we'll highlight a number of these pieces as we go. That's one particular tool, and it's I would say, the nerdiest of the tools, in the sense that it is an electrical engineer's or a planner's vision of how to pull things together. But we will also go all the way down to what's a very human and individual scale. And so just to kind of highlight the work that Blue Energy has done, this is the work that Matthias has been involved in. This is one of our doctoral students from Berkeley. There's a number of the communities where this team has been in operation on the Atlantic coast in Nicaragua, and we'll come back to that a couple times in Diego's conversation. But just to highlight, we're talking about everything from energy efficiency, so old style and new style light bulbs, to energy generation technologies. In fact, Blue Energy has been a leader in doing incredibly low-tech but quite functional wind turbines, to the information nexus, and one of our students learned how to colorize well, so we're colorizing the things on here, to discussions in the markets, and here's a woman selling fish in a market, and here's fish that are frozen and fish that are not frozen. So we'll look at a number of these technology aspects of the story. And to highlight the technical piece of this, I'm going to just show quickly one qualitative graph, and then we'll just jump into what the students are doing. One of the ways that we've thought about this process, and many people, from people in pure science areas to very business-focused perspectives, have thought about how to put together low-carbon views of the future, is to think about, on the one axis, the cost or the benefit of investing in everything from better meters to compact fluorescent lighting, to installing public lighting, to new energy systems like biogas, solar, and wind, changing the size of generators, is to think about what does each one of these cost or save you, and then what's plotted on the x-axis is how big that savings could be. And the idea of putting together a picture of, can you achieve a low carbon, in this case, can you get effectively to no overall carbon emissions, is what this particular paper was about, that again, Christian Casillas, who's worked for years with the Blue Energy team, have worked on in Nicaragua, and to think about these types of systems. We are not active only in Latin America. There's actually a similar effort going on that Rebekah is also engaged with very similar small communities, in this case in Malaysian Borneo, where we've written similar types of analyses and had some kind of overblown, Borneo did not say no to dirty energy, but kind of perspectives on where we're going in terms of dreaming up new plans. But at the national level, Mexico has been a highlighted case of doing this kind of analysis of opportunities and putting them together and thinking through where could we go to get to a very much different energy system and one that's much cleaner. So the same kind of picture, not quantitatively, we'll just kind of highlight a baseline gross in emissions, and then a whole bunch of options to save in different areas, in agriculture, in the oil and gas sector, in end-use energy and transportation, electricity, and put together a very different picture. That's the big picture of where this team is looking. And the Mexican version of that little graph I just showed for community in Nicaragua is one that, in this case, they found a huge amount of potential savings. And if you read in detail what some of these are, you won't be surprised that Mexico, with a somewhat problematic national oil company, has huge amounts of savings in terms of end-use efficiency in public transportation, in how they design programs within Pemex and other companies. And so it highlights this kind of picture of thinking through lots of different options, putting them together to think through a picture that if you adopted some large fraction of these opportunities for savings, all of these below the axis are ones that we think could happen with saving money, and the ones above the axis would cost you money. And there's some debate around the economics of, do you really actually get paid back, or are you just saving? But there's been a number of these perspectives on national and regional level efforts to save energy and do so either with a tolerable positive cost or actually saving by being more efficient, providing better services, et cetera. The switch model that you'll hear a little bit about, we applied initially to North America, and I won't go into the details. That's not the point of the talk today, where we map out scenarios where you bring on natural gas, wind power, solar, various technologies, and look at the cost of various different cases, where gas prices are high or low, if you want to invest in nuclear or solar, more hydro, et cetera. That's the kind of perspectives we'll take a look at. Again, we'll highlight the ones in the Americas here, but we're working quite actively in other parts of the world as well. So I'm going to turn this over to Juan Pablo now to highlight one of, well, the most complete of these other models. As I said, we already have a model up and running right now, used by a number of Western states for Western North America. We will do the Chilean version, and then we'll talk a little bit about what's going on in the Caribbean, and then we'll end up with the work that's going on in Nicaragua and Mexico. So, Juan Pablo, your turn.
Thank you, then. Thanks. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'm moving on Chile then. Let me just emphasize a little bit these three items that you're seeing there. Those are three dimensions that we as Rail think are critical for evaluating and proposing meaningful analysis for planning electricity systems. Spatial resolution allows us to capture geographical diversity, whereas temporal resolution allows us to capture correlation between demands and supplies of specific resources at certain points of day. Together with a systemic analysis, with a broad view of the system, this means including generation, transmission, and distribution sector all at once, we can realize systems that usually private actors and even public governments are not able to see because they do not have the same vision. And that allows us to provide interesting developmental ways and paths of growing electricity systems. I'm going to briefly describe a little bit the Chilean system. Some of you may know about this. There are two large systems, one in the north called the SING and one in the center, the SIC. These cover basically 99% of the population and around 99% of demand as well. The two smaller systems are out of the analysis as well, with the exception of this portion over here, in which the potential hydro-ICM project that you might have heard about could be located. Currently, the Chilean northern grid is basically purely fossil fueled in terms of coal, mostly 75% coal and some natural gas. And the SIC is currently quarter coal, quarter gas, quarter hydro, and some other elements. It was more gassy prior to 2004 when we had an agreement with the Argentina to import gas, and that agreement is no longer working, so the country struggled to recover from that absence of that resource. And currently the paradigm, considering that instance and other events that had happened, the paradigm is that the central grid should be fueled in the future only through fossil fuels and mostly coal. If one see the current plan that the Ministry of Energy has put together, is just what they call a suggested plan, since in Chile all the decisions are made by private actors. But the suggested plan is that Chile should grow in the central part at least 75% based on coal in the next 20 years. So with Sweet Chile, we're trying to challenge some aspects of this paradigm in the country. One of the critical questions we're trying to answer is whether the hydro-ICM project is required or not. And a central planning system like Switch allows us to ask and answer that precise question. What you're seeing here is what the Patagonia, one of the rivers, the Rebekah River, could look like with a dam that is proposed. And there, the other half of the problem, which is a transmission line that is proposed to carry the energy from the southern point of Chile, as I mentioned over here, directed to Santiago right here in the middle. It's a 1,800 kilometer line that would cross around 12 national parks. So the key question here is whether is it socially beneficial to build this dam, and under what circumstances is it? And what we found with Chile is that unless a country takes a real strong stance towards evading CO2, that means getting to a level where the country decides as a whole not to emit more CO2 than it did in 2011 by 2030, then the whole hydro-ICM project could make sense. In social sense, it makes sense because the whole country has made the decision not to emit. Under a business as usual scenario, the country is quadrupling its current emissions under our analysis, and hydro-ICM is not built, simply just because it's too expensive. when it's built under different scenarios of abatement and it's partially being built, in all the cases, the transmission line is never built to Santiago using direct current circuits. It's using a connection towards Puerto Montt, which is much closer here in the south, and then retrofitting the whole existing trunk transmission system towards Santiago. Which is something that is socially beneficial, but that the private actors wouldn't like because they want to sell where demand is high in Santiago. So this analysis highlights one key political element that Switch helps to solve, which is whether you want private benefits or whether you need social benefits and how those two play. And in the case of Federated, the decision it's tilt towards, well, if you want social benefits, then the decision is broader. I'm also going to highlight a couple of curves that we built using Switch Chile. You don't need to read in detail, but I'm just going to give you a feel of what's being pictured here. On the left, it's a graph that depicts potential future emission growth paths, ranging from a business as usual scenario, going really high. This is like almost 5.5 times the 1990 emissions, towards a really clean scenario where we emit around 10% of 1990 emissions. That's a huge difference in scenarios, right? Those are all potential paths that the country could follow, choosing a certain set of technologies and assuming a certain cost in their power sector. In the right side, you see the cost that those scenarios imply. I'm not going to refer to the particular numbers, but you will see that there is a relatively narrow cluster here where almost all scenarios are bounded by a $10 or $11 per megawatt hour box. Whereas on the left side, there is a huge disparity in where we could end. These sort of results highlight that the political process behind choosing what kind of country Chile wants to be in the future lies before the decision on whether to build either a center or not, or whether to build other projects or not. This sort of analysis shows that we have plenty of ways of ending in 2031 by emitting either 5 times what we emitted in 1990 or maybe half of what we emitted in 1990. And the costs are relatively close between them. So what we need to say here is not that we should follow the least cost path as the country as a whole is aspiring to through the private actor decisions, but where do we want to go as a country given that the costs are relatively narrowly together? And so maybe internalizing a couple of internalizing social benefits could mean a relatively small amount of cost in the electricity sector, but a huge difference in emissions. Finally, there is a number of myths that abound in Chile regarding the intermittency of some renewable energy resources, such as wind and solar. With Switch, we have been able to debunk one key myth, which is that for each unit of intermittent power, either from wind or from sun, you need 1 unit of capacity to back it up. Either, in this case, I put gas turbines or 1 unit of storage. What we found in Switch is that when you look at the system holistically, you get all these synergies and all these diversities, geographical and temporal diversities together. And therefore, what we find is that you only need 1 unit every 4 units of intermittency. Why is this? Well, sun shines in the middle of the day, pretty well correlated to the demand in the middle of the day. Wind blows in different times of the day in different parts of the country. So when we pull them together through a transmission grid purposefully built for that, then we get these correlations and this diversity that allows us to reduce much more the amount of backup that we need. So systems are much cheaper than usually this individual analysis suggest. And these 3 elements that I have highlighted in the case of Chile are some of the results that allows us not to propose a certain path, but to propose and frame a certain discussion about how the country should politically decide where to go, rather than what to build and what is least cost. I'm going to hand it now to Rebekah.
And just to say, Rebekah has this unusual situation in that she's worked on island systems both in the Caribbean and in Southeast Asia. So there's an interesting aspect of comparison. But today we'll hear about the work in the Caribbean.
Thanks. Can everyone hear me okay? Thanks, JP. That was a really good argument for why issues other than grid parity are important in energy policy and decision making. And so now I'm going to talk about 2 of the less nerdy tools that Dan was talking about earlier that we've been working on in the Caribbean. So just to set the stage a little bit, Yes. Just to set the stage a little bit, most Caribbean islands are actually almost 100% dependent on petroleum to supply electricity demand and needs. And with oil prices hovering around $90 to $110 a barrel, this has obviously put the islands in a difficult situation. And that's the case in the US Virgin Islands, in US territories such as the US Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, as well as other islands. Electricity prices in the region average around 30 to 35 cents per kilowatt hour, so 3 to 4 times the average in the US. And at present, over 90% of total energy use in the Caribbean is actually fueled by oil. And electricity is just one facet of that. And can be a very major draw on national revenue. So we can take a look just at Jamaica as a case study and see here, over here. Right. So the script didn't come up very well, but on the y-axis we have millions of barrels of oil equivalent, and so you can see electricity as well as the bauxite industry, road and rail transportation, and shipping and aviation, all contributing to oil dependence in Jamaica. And so this lack of diversity leaves the Caribbean islands very vulnerable to, especially as price takers, always price takers, leaves us very vulnerable to commodity market volatility and a reliance on outdated and unreliable power plants. And I'll just say quickly that there are many barriers that are kind of standing in the way between where we stand now and more diverse portfolios. Some of those issues include grid stability and issues of grid flexibility, which JP was kind of pointing out, but also our issues of scale, economies of scale and financing, and particularly a lack of enabling legislation for independent power producers and utility companies. In the Caribbean, we have a situation where there are universal monopolies, so every island will have a monopoly utility company that has sole rights to the entire vertically integrated chain of electricity production, so talking from transmission, generation, distribution, even to retail and wholesale sales. And so that kind of creates a situation where the utility that has already sunk costs into existing generation does not really have an incentive to think about alternative energy resources, and without wholesale competition allowed on the grid system, we kind of have found ourselves in a sort of a stagnated place. And a lot of islands have put efforts forward to diversify portfolios. So there's projects going on in Jamaica right now, Wigton Wind Farms, Grand Sol in Grenada, we have Barbados, a lot is going on over there. Waste to energy development, a lot of solar, a lot of landfill gas projects now happening, and of course in Aruba and Curacao in the Netherlands Antilles. But this kind of leads us to the issue of what are other concerns besides grid parity, as JP was saying, and cost that enable policy discussions and act as drivers for policy change. So I'm going to talk about two models that we have been working on in the Caribbean. The first is going to be about carbon and carbon footprinting, and the second is going to be about green jobs. So in 2010, the governor of the US Virgin Islands signed a memorandum with the US Department of Energy to create a clean energy development strategy for the territory. And the goal was to reduce fossil fuel use 60% by 2025. So in order to catalog where opportunities to implement energy conservation and efficiency measures are existing, it's important to understand the territory's energy landscape outside of the utility boundaries, and to understand how emissions are really being generated across consumption categories. So, but to this point in 2010, very few local industries had been using data to do those types of analyses. So we stepped in with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL, and the US Department of Energy to use local census data and local household survey data to chart spending on utilities, transportation, food, goods, services. And then we used what is called an economic input-output analysis tool. It's in short, a large sum of data that's been pooled together by the Green Institute at Carnegie Mellon. And they have this large data set that's based on life cycle assessment data from the US. And it tracks, for every good or commodity, it tracks from collection of materials to processing to use to disposal, and maps that to economic indicators such as purchasing price. And so we were able to use that data and map it to consumption data in the US Virgin Islands and come up with what is called a carbon footprint for households. So what we were able to find is that the average carbon footprint in the territory is somewhere around 13 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year per capita, so per person, which is roughly 35% less than the average US per capita footprint. In the US, it's roughly 20 tons of carbon dioxide 20 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per capita, and in Hawaii, like another US island territory, something like 17 tons. So one thing that was really interesting from our results, and again, sorry for the print, but was that electricity and food compared to the US are such a large part of the mix. In the States, the household impact of transportation is 30% more than electricity, but in the Virgin Islands, as you can see, electricity is really the main contributor, despite the fact that in the US Virgin Islands, we use 3 times less energy or annual kilowatt hours than in the US. So that again emphasizes the carbon intensity of generation itself and efficiency. And in fact, contribution of household utility services in the US Virgin Islands is almost double the global average. But fuel for transportation is also an important factor, and it's increasing. And since 2000, diesel use in the territory has actually tripled. So that's also representing an area for emissions reductions and abatement measures, such as a local fuel efficiency standard. So here we have a similar graph for US households. And we have here what is called an abatement curve, and Dan showed a larger image of this earlier on. And so the usefulness of a tool like this is to be able to almost kind of invert this data and say, for various industries, industrial, commercial, etc., what goals are possible to be set and what would have to be done? What are different types of measures that can be taken within each of those different industries to achieve the goals that we want in terms of carbon and emissions reductions? And we've developed, just to say quickly on that tool, we've since kind of refashioned it for French Polynesia, where we're using it more for a building study analysis. But that data is all in an online tool that's open access, and it's completely available to the public to use. And so it was used in the US Virgin Islands Energy Efficiency Campaign 2010 to 2012. So the second tool that I'm going to talk about in thinking about other drivers that support policy decision and policy conversations is a green jobs estimation tool. So the development of local sources of clean energy may also create more jobs per unit of energy produced or generated than fossil fuel economies. And many of these jobs are likely to stay local because they involve actual physical construction and installation. So a tool that can be useful in testing this sort of theory for decision making is a green jobs estimator. So again, for the US Virgin Islands, we built a green jobs estimator using data that is both local and regional. So we mapped, we took data from literature from the US and Europe that looks at, for different types of energy resources and generation techniques, what are the total amount of jobs that are involved in the construction phase, in the installation phase, and in the operation and maintenance phase, and also in the dismantling phase. And then we also took very local specific data or locally specific data from projects happening in Jamaica, in Grenada, in Barbados, and in Aruba. And so we compiled all of that data to come up with a sort of a spreadsheet that's also available online. And what it shows us is basically for different types of future scenarios for the US Virgin Islands, what are the kind of job estimates or job numbers that we could really be thinking about? So if we were to model the same scenario as we looked at before, where we have a 60% emissions reduction, or fossil fuel use reduction, sorry, through both energy efficiency and renewable energy, and that would be this scenario over here on the left. What would be the total number of jobs that could be created from that sort of situation? So we actually found that there's a modest number of jobs that could be created, 540 by 2016, and then over 800 jobs by 2025. And I just want to make a clarifier there that when we say jobs, sometimes that can be that word can be used, can be misused, especially if you're not applying some sort of duration to the term. So the job really depends on the lifetime of the project, and a better metric would be a job year. So you take the total number of jobs that would be available, that would be needed for a project over its entire lifetime and then divide those into years. And so we found that for the Virgin Islands, actually something on the order of 2,000 job years could be created by 2025. And talking about islands that are, population 40,000, that's significant. And a lot of those jobs would come from energy efficiency and indirect jobs. Indirect jobs meaning things that supply industries that support utilities. And energy efficiency, we're talking about everything from electricians to carpenters, architects, roof painters. And just as a quick pull-out for an example of how this relates to policy decisions, cool and insulated roofs are now becoming very popular in the US Virgin Islands and can reduce a household's electricity demand by 10%. So that's about 1 ton of carbon dioxide for the average US Virgin Island household. And if we had a 15% penetration rate, that would be 5,500 tons of carbon dioxide per year, 3,200 megawatt hours saved, and a potential for more than 80 direct jobs, not including the indirect jobs that would come from that as well. So this is just another example of how we've been working with the islands and government and decision makers to think about what are the other metrics, the other benchmarks that support decision making other than grid parity, and that can help drive policy decision making. So I'm going to hand it over to Diego for a little bit, and he's going to wrap up our discussion.
And again, to wrap up the student cases, you've seen both the national level in terms of this energy system modeling, and then how some of these particular tools are being used to look within the sectors. And Diego's will now actually be a mix between looking at the national level and looking at these smaller grid systems. And so you'll see a mix of both the two things you've seen before and what you'll hear now.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. So I'm going to be talking about a project I'm working on for my master's and PhD that I like to call a top-down, bottom-up approach to energy planning. The idea is to work with colleagues at the National Engineering University in Nicaragua, Maria Virginia Moncada, who's in charge of the Master's of Renewable Energy, one of her students, Salvador Gaitan, and a renewable energy entrepreneur called Lal. And the idea is to build Switch for Nicaragua, the low-carbon tool that JP and I have been discussing, and to build a microgrid that can be grid-tied, that can provide ancillary services using renewable energy either in the Atlantic coast, that Dan mentioned before, or in the capital city of Managua. So one question that really matters for countries as small as Nicaragua and some of the countries that Rebekah was discussing is why do we care about carbon in these countries? Right? If the emissions are but a tiny fraction of what the US emits, Canada emits, China emits, you name it, why should we care about carbon? This is a key question that I got asked when I first started working with my colleagues. For the case of Nicaragua, there are two answers. One of them is that there's a large dependence of oil, on imported oil, that comes with a lot of risks for the energy markets in the country. And the second one is that, particularly in Nicaragua, the phenomenon of El Niño, La Niña brings a lot of hydroclimatologic variability to the region. So if your future plans are depending on large hydro, and are also depending on oil, then you're putting yourself at risk for a variety of different factors that you have absolutely no control of. So with Switch, when you're controlling for both of those factors, then you're allowing for more resilient energy system. So the idea in this project is to work with my colleagues and for them to discuss with policymakers in Managua how to include Switch results in future energy planning. Just to bring this point home a little bit further, in the 90s, set of deregulation structures by some banks set the path forward for oil dependency in the country. The entire structure was unbundled, generation, distribution, transmission became different companies, and oil became, now in 2013, 55% of the exports that Nicaragua sells go towards paying oil debt. So we could talk about macroeconomic indicators, we could talk about balance of payments, foreign exchange rates, you name it. But what really matters to the people in the country is that hospitals, roads, water infrastructure, irrigation is not being built to pay for an oil debt that started in the 90s. So Nicaragua sees this not about emissions, but as a sustainable plan for the country. More recently, in 2012 and 2013, the IDB and Bloomberg Energy Finance named Nicaragua the second and third country in the entire Latin America with the most promise for renewable energy penetration. This is huge for a country that is the third poorest in the entire Western Hemisphere. So if we look at this graph and we imagine, and we put developed countries, Australia, Sweden, Denmark, other countries like Mexico and Chile, at the same level of GDP per capita, that they all achieved at different levels, Nicaragua, the level of income that it has today, already has a higher penetration of non-hydro renewables into the grid. This is laudable and it's great, but it also comes with a set of different challenges. That means that difficult resources like solar and wind that are difficult to integrate into the grid are coming to a grid that's intermittent, that's old, and that's needed with more investment. So this only shows you how invested countries like Nicaragua are in transitioning to a more sustainable energy future. If you change the x-axis and you put demand per capita at the same level for other countries, the graph will look exactly the same. So that is a big picture planning that I'll be doing for Nicaragua. But the bottom-up approach really matters to understand what really is happening on the ground. And there's two things. One of the maps I showed you, the entire Atlantic coast was without energy. In the Atlantic coast of Nicaragua, we're hoping to work in the Huahuashang Nature Reserve, and particularly with an educational center called FATCANIC that works with agroforestry, sustainable practices in the region, and climate education. The problems in places like the Atlantic coast and the nature reserve are completely different than the problems that you see in Managua. So ideally, we'll be choosing a community to work with where the technology will be the most disruptive and where most of the change will happen. Personally, I'm leaning more towards working in Managua for a variety of reasons in terms of how population is changing. People are moving to the cities. The load profile and energy consumption of Managua is mainly residential. So most of the gains in terms of energy efficiency, integrating solar panels and correlating with load, like Juan Pablo was saying, are more important in the city. If you show a pilot project, proof of concept, but solar can be integrated without problem into the grid, that you can interconnect a microgrid for critical loads like hospitals and schools in the city, then the energy ministry sees that it can be applied in many other parts of the country, including the Atlantic coast. So that's all I have to say. We'll keep you updated about the project.
Okay, so
we'll
we've
take
done our
questions.
best to go through very quickly, and again, not to do technical details. We're happy to get into them, but hopefully the motivation and the opportunity is to talk about some of the local energy and development projects and opportunities. So do you need to do a microphone, or can people just stand? Aha, we do. Okay. So if you have a question or comment, just fire away. If it's for a particular project, let us know. If it's more general, hopefully it'll be obvious in the question. So we'll go from there.
Hey. First, Matthias says he apologizes for ducking out early, and I was supposed to convey that to you all. Great presentations. I have many questions, but I guess I'll start with two. The first being in the case, English and Spanish. Case of Chile. What are you counting as a social benefit? For example, are the people living in where it will be built, are they being taken into consideration? And then what are the necessary kind of trade-offs with perhaps solar in Atacama? And the second question being about the Caribbean. I know it's much more expensive and fuel being that expensive. However, I was wondering if you could talk if there's any relation with Chavez's death, if the countries that you work on receive aid from Petrocaribe, and then if there are any relationships with his death. And Nicaragua, I'm still thinking about.
We'll start with Chile. Maybe.
Okay, yeah. It's a great question because I was not clear about what those two terms like private benefits and social benefits meant. In the case of Switch, when we speak about social benefits, it's mostly referring to the fact that Switch is a least cost or a cost optimizing tool. So it doesn't calculate profit for any particular developer or any particular project. It calculates the least cost mix of investments in transmission and generation that allows to meet load and other constraints. In this sense, it doesn't internalize any potential benefits, side benefits of these technologies. But it doesn't also guarantee that a private actor would get a determined return over their investment. So that's how we talk about social beneficial or privately beneficial costs in the case of Chile. So in this case, there is not an evaluation over particular benefits for the ISM population, or whether in Atacama someone is being locally benefited by deploying solar power in the desert.
Yeah, and just to mention, yes, there is a Petrocaribe agreement that exists in the Caribbean region between Venezuela, Trinidad, and a lot of the Eastern Caribbean islands. And so what that does is kind of set the price that these islands would have to pay for oil. But what still happens is that for electricity, there is a very hefty fuel surcharge on the rates. And so for a residential rate, something like 40% of the rate can actually be just the fuel surcharge alone. And so it still represents a very large portion of a household's income or a household's expenditure. So
who places the fuel surcharge?
the utility companies. And there are usually not very stringent, like in the States we have price setting mechanisms between the CPUC and utility companies such as PG&E, SDG&E, and so on. And those kinds of annual or sometimes every 3-year sorts of mechanisms don't necessarily exist in a lot of the islands. So the fuel surcharge kind of is at the leisure or direction of the utility company.
So these prices you're citing are subsidized rates? What?
Yes, subsidized through the exactly before through the agreement. Yeah.
So
Still subsidized and still that high. Yeah.
So one thing that connects both the local cases and then the sort of national level modeling, whether it's Nicaragua or Chile, is that it sounds quite obvious to kind of an outside the utility audience to say, well, it of course makes sense to think holistically about the system overall. I mean, it's, in an academic conversation, it's kind of where you would start. Say, well, obviously one should think about these overall set of costs and benefits. In fact, the way that utilities are structured and the way that the relationships with utilities, whether they're a single monopoly one or whether there's a few large grid systems like you saw in Chile with separate pieces, is that it's very difficult unless there is a wider perspective to think outside of the decision making around, should I finance this one particular next incremental project? Should I finance this new transmission line or this dam? It's been very difficult across the energy sector broadly to say, how do I think about these wide range of scenarios? And so the picture that Juan Pablo showed with a whole set of different scenarios that had very different outcomes in terms of emissions, but also in terms of land use issues and water, but a very similar cost across a wide range of scenarios, that sort of conversation is very, very hard to find and maintain in the utility sectors around the world.
Thank you for the presentation. I just wanted to ask you, what would you say is the biggest blocking issue for energy transition in each of the countries or regions that you're working in?
And just to clarify, by blocking for transmission projects specifically, or do you mean something broader than?
Something broader on a national level. Why is the energy transition going slowly or slower than it could be technically?
So I'll start with a general one, and then maybe want to jump in. One is the point that Diego made, and that is that none of the countries in Latin America have a carbon price regime in place, because why should they? Right now, the international discussions around greenhouse gases has gone nowhere, more or less. Europe started off with a very aggressive perspective. Europe has scaled back dramatically. There is no national regime in the United States. And as this was initially envisioned, these was only supposed to be industrialized countries only. So while we think of a whole variety of Latin American countries as industrialized today, they still officially fall outside of the countries that should be acting. And those countries that should be acting aren't acting. So why bother? Right? So there's one reason right off. There's no outside imperative for a carbon-based decision making. One of the sub-themes in all of the talks was there are some interesting and strong local benefits to add this as an important metric even before there's an international regime. So that's one piece of the story. And the other one is simply that the Latin America, because it's so hydro-dominant compared to most of the rest of the parts of the world, is actually lower carbon than most of the rest of the world anyway. And so if you simply say, well, why should we act relative to another country? almost every, but not every country in Latin America already looks relatively good on this metric. Not compared to what I mentioned for where we have to be in 2050, but compared to other countries, they're actually doing remarkably well because of the strong role of hydro.
Yeah, okay. So I want to say three things, particularly about Nicaragua. One of them is just very basic education and cultural paradigms between utilities and energy planners. When you sit at an energy planning desk with people who run the utility and people who are in charge of energy planning, then people in the utility have this vision of renewables being impossible to being integrated into the grid. If that happens in California and it happens in parts of Europe, then in a place like Nicaragua, just a person who's in the dispatch center thinks it's impossible to have, 20% wind at any point during the day. So these myths about renewable energy need to be broken, and that can only be done with education. The second one in Nicaragua is related to the economy and the benefits of what are considered important to the economy for growth. Sometimes renewable energy is more expensive than other projects, but if you put everything on the right baseline, if you took into account the environmental benefits, if you took into account the localized benefits that Dan is talking about, then renewables become more valuable than traditional fossil fuel energy. In terms of technical aspects of engineering, we know how to integrate renewables. We know that it can be done. It's just a matter of cultural shifts and paradigms within some of the planning centers.
And just two more issues to speak specifically about the Caribbean. Dan and I actually wrote a paper about this exact issue a year or 2 years ago, kind of looking at a historical trend of energy sectors within different Caribbean islands. And what we found was that really one of the main issues is enabling legislation, so legislation that opens the grid up to independent power producers. And there are islands that are now trying to address that sort of problem, thinking particularly about Barbados. And right now we're doing a project there where the Barbados Light and Power Company is trying to lobby for new legislation. But even in islands where that kind of legislation does exist, so if you take, for example, Jamaica, where IPPs are allowed onto the grid system, the issue of financing is particularly key. Because of scale, it's difficult to attract international financing, and because of a lack of risk management options, local financing is difficult to come by as well. So groups now like the IDB and the IFC are trying to help develop investment programs specifically for individual Caribbean islands, working with the Caribbean banks and so on. So that I think are the two main issues that are really holding things back.
I might add as well, in the case of Chile, maybe it travels to Latin America as well, and this stems out of my research for my master's project, is that taking a renewable energy path is mostly a distributional decision. It means making a decision on taking from some existing incumbents and moving into new entrants for specific technologies, and also making a decision across time on emitting less into the future or more. And then distributional issues are inherently political, and that puts a lot of pressure in the democratic systems that are in Latin America, and whether those democratic systems allow people to participate in those decisions. And this is a very broad answer to what might very well be a very broad question, but in that extent, the political element behind renewable energy adoption in large extent, it's critical, and the type of regime you have in a certain country also influences a lot whether you can make the transition or not and how long it's going to take.
Thank you very much for the presentations. I have two questions, and I recognize you all work on very specific areas, but I would guess that you have a broader knowledge. I'm just kind of curious if there are any countries or examples that you would cite in the region that are especially interesting, innovative, and a real commitment towards meeting some of these goals, and areas perhaps different than where you're already working, if you know them. And secondly, I've read a little bit about Richard Branson's initiative in the Caribbean to try to lower carbon footprint. I was wondering what you think about that.
So maybe I'll start on it. I mean, many of the countries are interesting because of the mix of resources that are available and some of the benefits that Juan Pablo talked about in terms of cost issues and routes, and what Rebekah talked about in terms of local jobs. One striking feature is that very few Latin American countries are leaders in technology development in the sector. And that's quite striking when you look at the opportunities. Right now we look at Europe, a little bit of the United States, and China as the big producers of these. That doesn't need to be the case. And actually the same analysis that highlighted Nicaragua as potentially the second best place to invest behind Brazil highlighted the real lack of manufacturing in this area. And if you think that this process is one where some combination of public sector interest to make a change, doing so there's different accounting that Rebekah highlighted might tip the equation, without a strong and vibrant private sector, it's not going to happen. And obviously if the manufacturing part of that story is missing, it makes it quite weak. So countries that have a strong manufacturing base, so Argentina and Brazil and Mexico stand out immediately as places with a high level of interest because they're often leaders in getting new manufacturing in the region. Those are places that immediately jump to mind. I mean, there's others as well, but those right off come out as places that warrant special attention. It's just one of the reasons why next year, this Fulbright Nexus program will be doing Brazil as the other anchor with the U.S. in this area.
And just to speak briefly about Richard Branson, sorry, before we move on to the next question. So he's very influential in the British Virgin Islands where he owns Necker Island. And a few years ago, Dan and a previous graduate student actually designed a system, a microgrid system for Necker Island to make it entirely dependent or 100% renewable. And that
which they didn't adopt.
Yeah, has been not implemented. And I think just last week, his group, the Carbon War Room, had an energy conference for Caribbean heads of state. It might not have been heads of state.
It was ministers.
Ministers in Necker Island. So I think that they're vocal, but it really harps on JP's comment about the political factors that are at play and the political kind of atmosphere that makes it very difficult when you have so many different individual states involved in trying to create regional policy. I think that's still a stumbling block. So,
just to add one more thing, in terms of the countries that you wonder are leaders in this area, I would say that the ones that are leaders are the ones that are challenging the hypothesis that was put forth a long time about the environmental Kuznets curve. They have to be rich to care about being clean. And I would say countries like Nicaragua and Costa Rica are countries, Costa Rica specifically, of integrated renewable energy.
It's actually worth noting that the head of the Carbon War Room is former President Figueres. So, and he points out that he's the only leader so far who at a national level oversaw a public vote that resulted in a carbon price. And he didn't serve as many terms as he would have liked.
And let me add one country that's probably off everybody's radar. Uruguay has three powerful reasons why they're moving really fast in adopting wind. One, they have strong connections to Argentina and Brazil to move blocks of energy whenever they need it. Two, they have a lot of hydropower that they use to balance intermittency. And three, they have a strongly involved state that takes decisions and that doesn't have distributional consequences, so they can move fast. And they're doing so. And Uruguay could be a powerful country in terms of wind in the next 5 or 10 years.
So the wind isn't connected to marijuana.
They might be blowing just to get the smell to other places.
Hi, I had a question about microgrids. It was mentioned in the Nicaragua presentation, but do you see kind of these, I guess from a bottom-up approach, these microgrids kind of popping up and making a difference, and maybe in the Caribbean islands as well, since they depend on imports? Do you see those playing a factor in the future?
Yeah, so in Nicaragua, the part of the Atlantic coast that is not connected to the grid already has about 35 microgrids. But many of these microgrids work with oversized diesel generators. So the microgrid that we're talking about is a microgrid that would be a hybrid between PV and biogasification. And yes, that could make a huge difference in terms of the fuel that you put there, in terms of deforestation, of electrifying stoves instead of burning biomass. So yes, I see a huge advancement there. But I also see that making a point in the city. I feel personally that it's picture perfect to have a microgrid in the rainforest. That's the picture that will sell. But in being from Mexico City myself, I know that many of the problems really lie in the heart of the city. The urban poor are oftentimes poorer than people in rural areas. So if we're making proof of concept in cities, it's something that could be huge advancement not only for the city, but for rural areas.
Could the urban poor kind of buy themselves a solar cell, so to speak, and create?
So the idea it would be to have a government intervention in doing a lot of things. There's a lot of things that solar in cities can help. Generation is just tied to load, so reduce distributional losses that are huge in Nicaragua. You can reduce energy prices, and you can sell ancillary services within the city for people making money. But there's a lot of things that have to be considered. Stealing panels, that is rampant in cities in Latin America, so there's a lot of things going on.
Yeah, big issue. And in the Caribbean, I would agree that there are a number of urban demonstration projects for microgrids, and it really depends on the island, to answer your question. There are some islands where transmission is kind of extensive, and so most of the island is grid connected. But there are other countries like Jamaica that are much larger, Puerto Rico much larger, where there are a lot of rural populations that are not grid connected, where microgrids could potentially really have an impact. So.
This is also one of the areas where there's the most change going on right now technically in terms of new hardware, not only for generation and price changes, but also in all the hardware to connect things together. And so the example mini grid that we described from the coast of Nicaragua is there's the short paper on it is over on the counter there. But it's one of the areas where a number of the oldest barriers have broken down most rapidly. You either had to have a small diesel generator, you had to have a certain level of capital to do that. Now people are seeing these mini grid, microgrids, whatever you want to call them, as one of the biggest enablers of a new way to think about community energy, whether it's kind of urban and peri-urban areas, or whether it's the classic rural microgrid in the rainforest that Diego mentioned.
Thank you for having this program. My name is Heather Rosemarin. Hi, Diego.
Hi.
I am the executive director of a new organization called the Inter-American Clean Energy Institute, and also a proud graduate of the law school here at Berkeley. So I wanted to follow up on the question about the regional perspective, because I think what you're doing is so important in terms of demonstrating the power of innovation and the power of the good example, especially around microgrids and high renewable penetration of renewable energy penetration. I want to bring Brazil into the conversation. Just a few facts so that everybody's on the same page. This is by far the largest electricity sector in Latin America. End of 2012, 120 gigawatts and growing at about 5% a year. Currently heavily dependent on hydro, and although the government presents the country as a leader on clean energy, their current 10-year plan, released a few months ago, projects 35 to 39 gigawatts of new large hydro, mostly in the Amazon, by 2012. So large hydro in the Amazon is a methane emitter because of the way that the tropical foliage decomposes. It's also obviously degrades the rainforest and has a human rights impact on indigenous peoples. So it's extremely important, I think, to have regional examples of alternatives. Yeah. So I'd love to hear responses on that, but I also want to say, so this doesn't sound like just a negative comment, that Brazil has been a leader on using reverse auctions to drive down the prices, particularly of wind and solar, and some really important recent data on that from December auctions. These are all unsubsidized auction prices. Wind is coming in at $49 US dollars a megawatt hour, and in the first solar-only auction, which was held by a state in Brazil, not at a national level, solar's coming in at $98 a megawatt hour. So on wind is cheaper and is beating coal. Natural gas at auction is price competitive with large hydro. There's so many wonderful alternatives, and I'd love to hear what the panel thinks.
So I mean, that's the core reason why this next year Fulbright Nexus program is designed to focus. Again, it's 50% U.S. and Brazilian, and then another 50% from everywhere else in Latin America and the Caribbean. And you're right. So just to put in perspective, that $49, the price of power in Western North America is on average about $100, and so that 49 is about half of our current price, and that $90 is just about cost competitive. You know, we've all read and know a lot about the very contentious history of hydropower in Brazil. What's interesting is that this is a government-to-government relationship, and of the topical areas that filter down from the president's office through the Ministry of Energy, large hydro is not on that research list. And so these 2-year partnerships are designed to explore the other areas. And so there's at least another kind of sign that there's an interesting change there. Brazil has also, as you highlighted, been a leader in some of the policy mechanisms. And to the extent that the critical piece that almost everyone here highlighted was you need to broaden or make more high resolution the picture of the energy sector, whether it's a given Caribbean country or whether it's Chile or the interaction of Chile and Argentina. That really speaks to the need to get more regional examples. And because Brazil is effectively not one country in terms of energy, that you need to get examples that work in the South, you need to get those that are sustainable and work in the Amazon and Rondonia. So I think that's really the goal for these efforts. Will they move fast enough to prevent this next wave of large dam construction is a big question, and it doesn't just affect Latin America. Africa is also, is experiencing record economic growth country by country, and Brazil is one of the biggest investors in large-scale energy projects in Africa, and most of those, as endorsed by the international lending community right now, are large hydro. So there is an equivalent effort to the dam every N kilometers along the Amazon, which is taking place right now in the Congo River. And it's an effort to sell massive amounts of power first to South Africa and then potentially all the way to Europe. And so the Africa-Brazil nexus is also really critical in terms of this kind of large-scale energy planning. So there wasn't really an answer to the question as much as, yes, it's a critical time to do something differently.
So unfortunately, we don't have time for more questions. I wanted to thank Professor Kammen, Juan, Pablo, Rebekah, and Diego for a great presentation. And thank you all for coming.
And thank you. Thank you.